Good morning and welcome everybody. This is a third video in the series, and today we're going to talk about tests. Because tests are really important. A good written test can save your job. Even it may save somebody's life. Tests are really important, especially when you're doing things that are really hard. So today we are going to talk about a couple of practices to make your test life better. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is go to our test directory. And inside of here, we'll have this base test case. What I like to do is copy that test case and create one for unit test case and one for feature. So here we can just change the name of the class to feature test case. And we'll modify our unit test case to extend this. And we'll remove this create application. And now in our unit tests, we can simply extend the unit test case. So if we ever need to add any sort of helpers, it will be very easy to do it from this base class. Now in our feature test case, there is a lot of things that we can do here to make our life easier. But first of all, let us run our test. So we can do it by running php artisan test. And here we can see that it passes. So we can add a filter by running php artisan test, and we can add a filter to only do our feature tests. So inside of here, we can see that there is, this refresh database commented out. What we can do, and this is really nice, instead of like having to remember to use that trait inside of every single test, which can be daunting. What we can do is just go to our feature test case, and inside of here we can do use lazily refresh database. And what this trait does is basically that whenever a database is executed, whenever we try to make a connection to the database, we'll first refresh our database, which is exactly what we want. So now in tests that don't use any database connection, this is never going to run. And in tests that require the database connection, this will be very, very handy. Moreover, whenever you are trying to do something inside of here, you usually have a user. So you're signing in as a user. So the way you would usually accomplish this is you would do something like, okay, let's revert that. You'd usually do something like this, sign acting as, and then you would do like user factory create, and then you would do a bunch of setup, and then you would do a response and then assertion. Also, while we are at it, what's important in your test is that you're consistent. What I like to do is just remove this test from the start, and instead of that, just use this test comment. Just makes it easier to read for me because the test just describes what it does. So it can say it does something. Now we have this unified way of saying how tests work, and it doesn't have this ugly prefix. But yeah, our test basically consists of three parts. We have the setup, or some people like to call it arrange, act, and assert. So there is three things. First, we create our world. So starting from a blank page, we basically set up any data that will be required in this test. So any prerequisites. Then we act. So it would usually be like an HTTP request sent to our server. And then we assert that something has happened. So for example, when we send a post request to our blog posts, we assert that there will be a new blog post created. Now, what you will find annoying, and most of the applications deal with some sort of permissions or roles, is that every time here you would add a role to the user, or add a permission, or add them to some theme, And like there will pretty much always be a user. So what we can do is go to our test case and encapsulate that logic here. So what I like to do is create a protected property called user and name it like current user. There will usually be like some sort of theme that I will also put in here. So let's call it current theme. And after that, what I like to do is create a function that will basically act as something that will create our user. So I will call it sign in. And inside of here, we can either pass a user if we ever need to extend that. And this will return self. And if there will be no user, we'll just create the user right here. So we can do something like, team equals team factory create. And we can do user equals user factory for team create. And now we can simply do this current user or current team equals team, and this current user equals user, this current team equals user team. Or we can do, team or user team if we want to avoid this additional query all the time, if it's even executed. I'm not even sure with factories. And after that, we can simply do this acting as, and then we pass the user, and then we can specify a guard here. So for example, I would often add a boolean here, like bool API equals false, and do something like, if API, then API, otherwise web. And this is great. Now in our tests, we no longer have to create this user. We can just do, this sign in, and this will create a user for us. And we can always like reference those directly, or if we want to, we can do like get user or get current user, which would simply return this current user. And we can type in that or specify a return type, and we can do get current team and simply return this current team. All right, but what about roles? That's a great question. So oftentimes you would have a role, right? So what we can do is simply do add like a new function called sRole. And this sRole will accept a role type, which is an enum that they have, which simply maps to those three values. Then it would accept a user. And to be consistent with that declaration that we created before, it will also accept the API as a flag. So now we can simply do this sign in as a user. If it's null, it will be created. And then we can do this get user assign role, which I never implemented. So this would be assign role, and here we would pass role value. I would normally create a help around this, but it doesn't matter. Then we can return this. So this will assign a role to our user, and we should also pass the API here. So now to push it even more, what we can do is we can create a helper for every role. So we can do admin, for example. And again, here we would do user and then bool API. This will return also self. And this will be a simple helper that will just wrap our sRole and just pass the role type for us, and then the user, and then the API. And the user should be obviously optional. And the API should also have that default value. So now we can duplicate that. So we'll have one for team owner and one for team member. Now we need to just update our enums that we are passing, clean up the codes, and this looks pretty neat. So now in our test, whenever we have an endpoint that should only be accessible, for example, to the team owner, we can simply do this as team owner. And this will create a user for us and then give them appropriate role. If we ever want to do some sort of permissions, we can also do something like with permission. This can, simply do this get get user, give permission to, and just for simplicity, I'll do string permission and just do this. And now we would be able to do something like as team owner with permission and then pass the permission. And this should return self. So we can chain additional stuff here. Normally I would have an enum from our permissions though. But yeah, let us run this. And it fails because there is no team permission in our user, which we will very quickly fix. And if we run our tests again, we'll get an error here because we don't have that route, but this was just an example I gave. And if we run it now, then we'll see that it works. So another great thing that you can do is make sure that your tests are passing in proper time. So for example, this is a great package that that does it for us. And what we can do is simply install that package to our project and then go to our PHP unit and just paste it right here. And it shouldn't have those pesky pluses. What we can also do is pass some default configuration. So for example, here we can set that the maximum duration of our test should be 500. And this thing here shows you how many tests there should be listed in the output by default. We can remove that. There is also like some way to configure that on test level, but we'll get to that. And after we install that, we can run our PHP unit. It won't work when we are going to run PHP artisan tests. We can do that. It will just show that everything is fine. If we run PHP unit, we'll be able to see that one test took longer than expected because it took because we did sleep one here. So if we remove that, we can see that it still took too long, and that's just because we are doing all of the migrations, I guess. Yeah, we can increase our threshold by changing that default configuration. So if we take that here, and paste it right here, and just do 2 seconds, for example, run PHP unit, you can see that everything is fine. And then if we just do sleep, maybe that's a bit extreme, sleep one, then let's do sleep two. We'll be able to see that this text took longer than expected. So this helps you debug your tests that are very slow. Another thing that I have seen, I don't remember who did that talk, but there was something in Laravel last year, I believe. That's when you do a post or post JSON to an endpoint, and then you're passing over data, right? So you are doing something like name is, fake name or something like that. Or if you don't do that, you can just do like John, because that's what people tend to do, I believe. So let's just quickly create an endpoint, be very nasty. Let's just do post users function request, and here we'll do user create name equals request get name. Please never do this at home. This is just for educational purposes. So if we do post to users with name as John, then we can assert that it was successful, and then we may want to assert database has, and then just do like something like users, and then name is John. Right? If we run our tests, you can see that field email doesn't have a default value. So let's just do the same thing with email, even better. So let's do john@example.com, and let's do email. There is also the password that doesn't have a default attribute, and we'll just do password is string random. And I think these are all the required fields. Yeah. So this will work. The thing is that, with that data, it makes sense. But if you had something that is more advanced, so like, for example, type equals 0, who the freak knows what type is? I don't. That's right. We don't know. Like, we don't know if it only works for Johns, for example. Maybe like that's the validation that we have. So what we can do is basically abstract the data away by using Faker, which has its ups and downs, right? Because like sometimes Faker will come up with a name that will break your system. That happens. Like that's how you get flaky tests. So normally, what was proposed by the author of the talk is to use like this notation, right? So you'd have this sort of like name at domain.com. In case we have like a validator. I don't even know if that's a valid email. But yeah, like the proposal was to like use this syntax to just say everybody that, okay, it doesn't matter what's inside of here, it's just a name, right? And obviously, if you want to, you can do something like name equals this, email equals this, and then replace the variables here to just use those variables. And if that's something that you like, that's great. I prefer to duplicate these, and I don't know, to me it's just more readable. All right. What's also important, especially for tests that are supposed to be documentation, is that you can provide some additional context here. So, for example, this is a dumb example, but when you're creating something more complex, you can define the business logic here, or you can describe your business logic here. So, for example, whenever we post to users, this is a bad example because it's like kind of self-explanatory. But you can like describe what sort of data should be accepted or what is the business requirement for this endpoint, basically. So that's another cool thing that you can do. And obviously, what's really important is that you have factories for every single model inside of your application. And I talked about how you can enforce that in last episode. And the last thing I want to say is that there is this really cool thing which you can do with PHP unit, and you can basically create something that's called data providers. So what data providers are is basically to kind of run your tests in loops, in a sense. So let's say that this endpoint should only be accessible by the team owner. So what we can do is we can do a public static function. Let's just name it like valid roles to create user provider. That's a dump name. And this like will return an array. So what we can do here is just to return role type, team owner. And we can do another one for invalid roles that cannot create user provider. This can be like an array. And here we can simply do role type team member, and role type team admin. So we can kind of change this at the moment. So we can add a data provider, valid roles to create user provider. And this will basically run this function multiple times and will accept our argument here. So our argument will be a role type, role. And now let's do sRole, pass the role right here. And this shouldn't change. Now we'll copy this whole test over. Let's do with valid role, we should say 403. And this will be invalid roles that can't create user. User cannot be created by invalid role. And here we can do, user can only be created by valid roles. So here we just accept assert status 403. Let's run our tests again. And I'm a Dumbo because this should be a race. Let me just quickly fix that and let's run this again. And now we can see that, there weren't just 3 tests in total, so like 1 unit and 2 feature, were 5 tests because we had 2 for invalid roles and 1 for valid. So yeah, this sums up to 4 tests. So now we just need to implement it. So the way we can do it is, add a middleware role equals team owner. Probably I would spell it different. There is another video about that. And in order to have that, we obviously need to bind that middleware to role middleware. We run it again. We'll get a lot of tests executed because we use those providers. All right, so I hope you enjoyed those tips, and if you did, please leave a like below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye.